I've been trying to work out what tapas dish I'm going to come as tonight. I've decided on patatas bravas. So, how are we doing? I work in the business school. I've been there 24 years in August. That period of time is spent mostly looking at how groups function in organizations, in particular what happens when you take groups and rather than having them as an addendum to employment at organization, you make them the fundamental organizing unit. Most of us think that organizations are built, that they're designed around teams and groups, but in fact, as Harold Levitt, who was a Stanford University psychologist, renowned psychologist, 30 years, complained against, in fact, we don't really take groups very seriously at all. His point, he wrote a very influential article in the 1980s which was called "Suppose We Take Groups Seriously." And his point was that managers had really failed to grasp the full potential of groups as fundamental building blocks in organizations. Traditional hierarchical, individual-based organizations, he railed, treated the individual as the fundamental unit of organization design and management control, and consequently bred, and I quote, infantilizing dependency, distrust, conflict, toadying, territoriality, distorted communication, and most of the other human ailments that plague every large organization. And that's what I've spent my career, or much of it, trying to work against. Much of my research over the past decades has been about what happens when you put organizations, groups in organizations front and center. This research is very applied. It seeks to demonstrate that designing organizations with groups as or teams or even communities as the primary design unit actually works better in many cases than traditional hierarchy in terms of the performance of the organization and the welfare of their members. Now let me just give you an example involving face-to-face teams. These, a while ago I worked with a graduate student. We worked with an organization operating 18 wastewater treatment plants in New South Wales. It was decided, not on a whim, but based on previous research that we'd done, that this organisation wanted to convert all these plants, which treated wastewater and sewage, to team-based operation, to remove all the managers and supervisors from each of the plants and completely hand over control of those plants, all aspects of plant operations, to skilled, self-managing teams of workers. The graph shown here depicts the overall impact of that reorganisation. What the graph does, it plots EPA data on variability in the release of pollutants in treated effluent into the waterways, into the river systems and into the ocean in New South Wales. The idea is that less variability around licence limits in these pollutants is a good, it reflects good performance. Now in our study, the the blue line reflects plants that use mainly chemical and mechanical treatment regimes, whereas the red line represents plants that use advanced, harder to manage, more complex, less reliable microbiological treatments of effluent. Now what you can see, hopefully, is that both these types of plants really struggled to control effluent quality before they collectivise. Lots of variability, in other words. When the reorganisation was announced, 6 months out from the actual formal state of the team-based organisation, formal start date of the team-based organisation, they started to work together informally as a team and things started to improve. You can start to see that the variability in those lines starts to reduce. Then, when managers and supervisors were completely removed from the plant and the teams became completely self-regulating, you can see that plant effectiveness in both kinds of plants has actually improved quite dramatically. Interestingly, the intervention had the greatest impact on those plants whose technology was most complex and less reliable and theoretically harder to manage. This simple transfer of managerial authority to empowered teams of skilled operators enabled the system to be far more responsive, unlocked underutilised talent within the operating teams, and facilitated additional operator skill and development over time. Importantly, it resulted in reductions in levels of pollutants in treated effluent being released into New South Wales rivers and oceans. For example, total phosphates released by these plants declined by about 60% over the 2 years of this particular study. That was then. These days, plants such as these are generally controlled by virtual teams, groups of geographically dispersed individuals who rarely, if ever, actually meet face to face, where team membership boundaries are flexible and dynamic, and where members' interaction with each other and with the processes that they manage is mediated almost entirely by digital technologies. The supplanting of physically co-located face-to-face teams with virtual collectives and organisations has occurred really at a dramatic rate over recent decades. Virtual teams with members located across time zones in different countries even, are now commonly used to control complex continuous operations in manufacturing, oil and gas production and mining. Some multinational organisations, for example Schlumberger would be one, now use virtual communities of practice, or COPs, as their primary unit of organising. COPs are groups of people who share a common interest, experience-based or passion, and who interact via digital technology to share ideas and try to transfer and implement best practice across an organisation. The problem with virtual collectives, however, is that the very features that define their virtuality, for example, geographic dispersion, diverse and changeable membership, electronically mediated communication, and dynamic structure, tend to undermine the traditional potency of teams, which derives from the development of strong feelings of mutuality and shared identity, shared knowledge, effective coordination, etc. For example, as this particular figure shows, research has generally shown that the more dispersed the membership of a virtual group is, the less effective and efficient it actually is. My colleague Christina Gibson has conducted a well-known study of global R&D teams, global virtual R&D teams in the aerospace industry. And she found that even when management was doing its utmost to try and support these virtual teams of engineers, increasing virtuality always equated to lowered performance. So what does that mean we should do? Should we, wherever possible, abandon the virtual collective in favour of the face-to-face as a basis for organising group work? Well, the answer, of course, is a resounding no. My recent research has focused on how organisations can best capitalise on the potential of groups, virtual and otherwise, whilst minimising the potential performance losses associated with typical features of virtual relating. So, working with a multinational mining company, we've been focusing on the potential of communities of practice to deliver performance improvements within its global network of minerals processing plants. Three main mechanisms by which these COPs can deliver such benefits include enhancing human capital or skill, enhancing social capital, or the way in which people relate together to combine their skill for improved performance, or enhancing organisational capital in the form of new knowledge and routines then become located within the organisation. Now, one of the features of these virtual collectives we've been studying is the degree to which they comprise members of different nationalities. We know from prior teams' research that increasing nationality diversity tends to lead to the formation of subgroups within teams around those national identities, which in turn act as barriers to effective communication and knowledge sharing. And these are often called demographic fault lines. When we look at the performance of some of our COPs, we see this in force. Increasing nationality diversity results in declining performance. However, this is only for when conventional communication technologies are used. When we look at virtual communities who use a range of signal-rich multi-channel communication technologies to interact and communicate, we see that the performance decrement that's so frequently observed with increasingly diverse membership in virtual collectives is transformed into a positive. We've found similar effects when communities take specific actions to develop a culture of psychological safety or to improve cross-cultural competence among group members. So it is possible to counteract some of these process losses that are associated with virtuality. You'll recall that I began this presentation by showing you what happens, or what can happen, to performance when you harness the true power of teams, in that case face-to-face teams. Could we expect to see similar transformational effects when organisations switch to using communities of practice, for example, as a major way of organising their activities? Well, we've been looking at this. This graph shows the number of new operating procedures introduced every week into 3 Australian minerals processing plants over a 6-year period. You can see that there are a hell of a lot of them. Generally speaking, when you introduce a new operating procedure into a continuous process within a refinery, for example, it's not a very good thing. It means that what you've been doing previously is not working well. And so generally you're trying to make something different or do something different in order to make things, in the hope that things will work better. It's disruptive. About 1 year into this particular data, the 10 core areas of production that were represented in this data within these 3 refineries were augmented by the formation of 10 related global communities of practice, with members deriving from 9 refineries located in 6 different countries all around the world. The timing of their formation is marked by those red lines. Now, to the naked eye, it seems as though the number of procedures, new procedures being introduced, and I hope you see the same as me, begins to decline, which is a good thing, significantly following the introduction of those global communities, following those red lines. You see a general downward trend. This is consistent with an argument that those COPs lead to the identification of better ways of working, which are vetted by communities and then shared across locations, leading to procedures being implemented that are better than the ones that they replace. But can we be certain that this improvement is due to the introduction of the communities of practice? Well, we think so. And to develop that proof, we need some fairly fancy statistics, for which I issue the standard health warning. Let me illustrate, if you'll bear with me, and those of you who are allergic to this can leave the room. Let me illustrate the basis of our confidence that these CAPs have been transformative and instrumental in this organisation having such improved operational control. In this figure, we see the results of Bayesian modelling, where the probability of our data belonging to a higher pre-communities of practice level, represented by the black line, versus a lower post-communities state, represented by the red line, is plotted. As you'll see, we start out with the probability that that data belongs to a pre-communities series being 1, the black line at 1. Then, just about the same time as we start to implement these 10 communities of practice, we start to see that that probability that the data belongs to the series that it started on starts to change, it starts to drop. And gradually, very shortly, in a very short period of time, contemporaneous with the introduction of communities, moves to 0. Conversely, the probability that the data belong to a different state, represented by lower incidence of these new procedures being introduced, starts to rise quickly and moves to 1. So the COPs were associated with rapid change, and it was a change for the better. Now, the real significance of this change becomes apparent when one realises that as a consequence of these changes, as a consequence of the introduction of fewer, better operating procedures in these plants, this particular organisation has been able to increase its annual production by millions of tonnes. That's millions of tonnes per year, whilst also simultaneously reducing the annual operating costs in its plants by millions of dollars, again per year. The benefits don't stop there. In other studies, we've been able to show that COPs deliver important psychological and tangible benefits to their members as well. But that's a tapas dish for another day. Echoing Harold Levitt's comments from 30 years ago, it's certainly time that organisations took virtual groups seriously. Thank you.